Well, Lawson was born in Gulgong in New South Wales, which is not far from Mudgee, which is again across the Blue Mountains, a long way from the city of Sydney. He wrote predominantly about life in the eastern states of New South Wales, and he wrote at a time when Australia was moving from a colony, so the colony of New South Wales, into the idea of being a federated nation, an important aspect to remember. The focus of this module of the high school certificate is actually the distinctively visual. And in so much as it is the written word, Lawson paints using words or captures like a camera using words the people, the landscape, their values of the values of those people that lived there at the time, and also the way in which society was structured at the time. And he does so using adjectives, strong verbs, adverbs, symbolisms, a metaphor, biblical allusion, and a variety of other techniques to create little snapshots of what it was like to live on the goldfields, what it was like to live in isolated communities as a woman by yourself with your children, what it was like to be a man in that time, like Joe Wilson in Joe Wilson's Courtship. So in all of the stories, you're given insight visually so that you can actually see what he's talking about. You need to be aware that there's a lot of idiom used, so idiomatic language, so language of the time that was understood by others, and also very Australian language, which was quite different to the traditional English sort of way of speaking that was predominant in the colonies, and that's called the vernacular. So there's quite a lot of techniques to look for, but they are adjectives, verbs, particularly strong ones, adverbs, symbolism, metaphor, biblical allusion, vernacular language, and idiomatic language. The last photograph was of a grassland, strong line of horizon with a setting sun. This is actually the riverbed of the Darling River, and I've included it because in stark contrast to a good season, this is in a dry season, and there is a story that you'll read called In a Dry Season, which depicts visually a train trip beyond Bathurst right through to Bourke, and this photograph is near Bourke. Now, talking about the distinctively visual, okay, Lawson really set about to create little snapshots so that the responder could easily visualise the personal experiences of the people who lived in this landscape. Even though the responder had never actually been there, he was able to transport the responder, and is still able to transport the responder to that little shed or that little shack in the outback with the mother defending her children against the snake, or to the mining camp where the loaded dog is running around, providing both humour and danger for Andy and his mates. So in this sense, he also used very strong characters who were sort of stock Australian characters. And even though it's not our as responders, not our personal experience, or wasn't at the time the personal experience of the reader, people understood because you could see it in your mind's eye and admire the characters. And so he created, and he really did this using forceful word pictures. So we actually see them physically doing things because of the way they're described. One stock character that's included in A Dry Season, and in fact it opens with this particular character, is the Fettler, and this is an image of the Fettler indeed here. This is a Fettler's camp. Now, Fettlers were involved in nation building, and you need to be mindful that Lawson was writing at a time of sort of that change between being a colony to being the nation of Australia. So the Fetler was included. The Fetlers were around the billy. The billy is a small kettle of sorts used to boil tea. Um, and the fact that they're standing around is actually quite symbolic, because that whole story in A Dry Season deals with quite individualistic, quite rugged men who are a little beyond being controlled, although they are actually in a dry season, so therefore out of work, which is quite difficult and quite evident in the poverty that is described. They are also quite proud, and you also see that in this image. The Fetler standing around that particular billy is quite important, because at the time um, they were not allowed, okay, to actually take a break in that way, and it was the union movement that actually made, sort of having, sort of a morning tea break come about. Now, you don't need to mention that in your essays, but you can actually just be very aware to look for the type of stock characters that are produced by Lawson. While they may face hardships, they are always very strong people and quite admirable. So while we might sort of fear for them, okay, and our fears are real fears. They're not based on sort of a sort of emotional weakness. They're actually based on real fears of real things. For example, the harsh landscape, the terrible dry season, the snake under the house with small children who are very vulnerable when you live so far, far away. So all of these things are actually produced, and Lawson's quite clear in doing it, sort of like in little vignettes. Now, vignettes are short visuals that often have sort of a romantic overtone and the romantic overtone might be the strength of the character. So, the audacity of the mother who can cope on her own while sitting quietly and silently with her dog in, fairly dim light, which is quite vividly described both metaphorically and symbolically in The Drover's Wife. That vignette is quite still, all right, but it's quite, and while it's a dangerous circumstance and we feel great pathos and sorrow for her, we admire her tenacity in facing it. So just in short for that one, Lawson uses stock characters. He has them speak, authentically. So they use vernacular language. They sound like real people. They sound like real Australian people, which is quite different for the time because they don't sound like English people. He uses narrative complications that also evoke authenticity. He uses humour. He uses humour a fair bit, but as a coping mechanism for the difficulties that people face. And he often uses symbolism like darkness and storms, flickering lights that are almost blown out to bring to life visually the dangers that people face. Now, Lawson was born in a tent in Golgong. This is actually a photograph of his mother outside a settler's house. You can imagine a snake could easily get in. And look, Lawson's mother, like many other women at the time, were left isolated in very harsh environments with their children. And Lawson actually had that experience. He's a native-born writer, and they called him a native son. They mean by that he was born in Australia, remembering that many people would have been born in England, okay, particularly writers. So for someone to be a writer who was Australian born meant that they had a distinctively visual sort of opportunity to portray the real lives of real people from their own perspective. Now, Lawson was the son of a Norwegian itinerant manual worker, so his father had actually emigrated from Norway. He'd started off as a selector sort of squatter, so he'd got a piece of land, hadn't done so well at it, so then he went prospecting, which is looking for gold, okay, and so and also he had some work as an itinerant worker, so he moved from place to place. Maybe he was a fencer, building fences, working on somebody's farm. Now his father wasn't particularly successful, and his father was also quite a drunk. So Lawson's own mother was left alone with children. You've seen the house, it was in the last slide, and very much like the family in The Drover's Wife. So he was concerned to tell the story of what it was like to be in that circumstance from an Australian perspective, and one that admired the people that were in it. So, both the drover and the drover's wife are admirable people, not necessarily seen as poor and not coping, which could have been another way of presenting them. So here we have a Google Earth shot actually of the Western Districts, and the sorts of landscapes that are visually depicted in Lawson's writing, and he conveys this landscape visually to sort of show his concerns, so that he creates scenes of the isolated settler, the poverty, the unemployment and the difficulties of unemployment that lead you to not be able to stay in your own place but have to move around and be itinerant and work in other places and thus leave your family behind, to stoically, to bravely sort of remain, okay, and deal with the circumstances that you come up against. Also, the dangers of the environment are depicted, sometimes using biblical allusions. So you've got the idea of the snake being dangerous, and the snake being related to the curse of the curse of Adam. So that all people are involved in this difficulty, and all people have to face these difficulties, and these are the difficulties of all people. If you look across the 4 stories, difficulties are a consistent theme. There's also the mateship is often depicted here in his stories. In order to survive the harsh landscape that we've got here, you have to be able to rely on others, and that in this society, this society of this isolated sort of outback world, people have to rely upon each other and rely upon humour in order to actually survive and not go mad. There are some mad characters, and they're depicted as mad, so that you can see that they've been driven beyond what they can't cope anymore. You look at the swagman in A Dry Season is an example of that. He was also very concerned to portray the pioneers and the settlers, and how different they were from the urban people of Sydney, even at the time, and so that people would look to the west and think of them as, the brave farmer who faces the constant battles and difficulties of life.